Chapter 6. All because of Grace. Joey's cell phone began to ring inside the black Hiace minibus. But this was the least of his concerns now. He needed to act swiftly to protect Grace. So, fueled by fear, Joey uttered a guttural yell.
No!
And sprung forward, then dove right, in a C-curve, away from Brian, towards Grace, swinging his left foot at the gun, missing it by an inch or less, then rolled swiftly to cover his girlfriend with his body. All of this happened, just as Brian had finished pulling back the trigger of the gun and the air flashed and ripped with a supersonic spitfire. Joey also felt a stinging jolt, as his and Grace's coupled shrieks filled the pre-nightfall. Then as Joey laid sprawled on top of her, he vaguely heard two rapid clicks above them, followed by an outburst of profanities, as if the trigger was pulled again twice but no other bullet wanted to obey their frustrated, ballistic crime boss. Grace raised her voice again to the highest decibel she possibly could and kept her palms pressed onto her face. Then came a low, rumbling sound, like a heavy vehicle rolling in towards their location, from somewhere in the far, winding distance. But Joey didn't know whether it was coming from his left or his right. As Brian kept on grumbling and swearing somewhere above them, a numbing, exhaustive agony ruffled through Joey's body. He gritted his teeth and grimaced.
Oh, God. Ah.
Joey groaned again, his face planted in the grass for a moment.
Die miserably, Simpleman. You're lucky I don't have time to speed up your death. But soon, we, readers, will start taking care of your relatives, one by one.
Joey barely heard the threatening, deep voice, fading, and then the slam of the door. Next there was a sound of a familiar vehicular rumbling, which, this time, sounded more like a peal of thunder, followed by crunching, grinding sounds, then the skidding of tires, and a receding roar, broken by the rough trek ahead. These particular sounds echoed from an unmeasured distance, maybe from the direction they had entered this road minutes earlier. The area went semi-silent, and Joey went partially numb. There was a torrent of excruciating pain tearing his head apart, as he finally rolled off Grace onto the ant-infested grass beside her. He rolled again, further away. His eyelids were sealed, and his mouth was wide open, as he groaned. At this point, since the firing of the bullet, Joey was oblivious of everything around him. Except for
Grace,
he whispered loudly. Then his entire being was charged with renewed adrenaline, and his eyelids ripped open. He shuffled, and wriggled, and pushed, and pulled himself closer to her, not caring for the ant's bites, or to know if the deadly deacon and the desecrated church bus were gone, nor even that the world existed, but only that Grace, his amazing Grace, the love of his life, was still alive. 22 days from now would be her 19th birthday. And he would make it very special for her, for both of them, by asking her to marry him in a creative, surprising way. He would. Joey froze above Grace, his face only a few inches away from hers. He couldn't smell her minty breath now, only a faint scent of her perfume ascended to the sensory receptors of his flaring nostrils. But her eyes were open.
Thank God. You're alive, babe.
He whispered in a raspy voice, a wry smile curling his lips, as beads of sweat dropped from his haggard face to the section of her floral dress that covered her right shoulder. His eyes still blurry, a couple inches above her rigid face, he noticed that her eyes were fixed and dilated. His thoughts contorted and seeped through his face. Why isn't she blinking? Why is she not flinching from the ants crawling on her skin and their bites? He brushed a few of them from off her neck. Then his face tightened again. And his eyes widened painfully. And a well of emotions finally overflowed a rim within him. He cried.
Grace. Oh, God, no. Grace.
He patted her face with his left palm, then squeezed her hands gently. His eyes slid down to her bosom, and, to his shock, that section of her dress had begun to soak in thick blood. And she also was getting colder and stiffer against his skin. Joey's mouth quivered, and he shook his head slowly in disbelief. Grace was bleeding from a hole between her breasts. She was. Oh God of Grace! No! His heart rammed his chest. Grace was dead. He hoped he was wrong. He had to be wrong. Frantically, he glanced around at nothing, and tried calling out loudly for help. But he was too weak to even pronounce the P in the word help. His swiftly exacerbated agony was nearing fatality. He was swaying and panting. He swallowed nothing but wanted to vomit everything. He sniffed and realized that he could barely move his limbs. His upper back and his chest still burned, more severely now, deadening his senses. Yet, his mind raced to forbidden places, to resurrect long-buried forbidden habits, to do justified forbidden deeds, whenever he revived. Brian, that devil, had shot and killed Grace. Which also meant that Joey had failed Grace. Again. Citing his self-assaulting jabs, he prayed silently for the millionth time, since Brian, that criminal, had halted the church bus in front of that rock in the dirt road. Once again, Joey felt like a loser. Why did he fall into Brian's trap? Why did he allow Grace to get out of the bus? No. He didn't control her. And he wouldn't have controlled her. So yes, it was Joey's fault. Their phones were carelessly left inside the bus. For although Grace had always cautioned him against carrying any radiated device inside his front pockets, especially so close to his reproductive organ, he had stupidly left it on the seat. Her warning had made good sense then. But not now. Still, how could they have suspected that Brian was such a devious, vicious animal? The deacon had never shown any indication of having evil tendencies towards them. Never, in the 9 years of Joey's friendship with him. And Grace had never mentioned Brian to Joey either, in all the years he had known her. Regardless, Brian was a killer, and now a fugitive and a dissident, while Joey was now a hurt man on the verge of hunting and killing Brian. Now Joey's sermon was long evicted from his mind. Also, the church was drifting further and further away from his conscience. At this point, he only cared about surviving, to avenge Grace's murder. His upper body was now shimmering in excruciating pain. Groaning loudly, he reached around to the back of his left shoulder and felt something thicker than water and a small, tender hole there. Then he brought his hand slowly before his face, and vaguely saw that his hand was red. His chest also was wet and sticky, like Grace's bosom beneath him. His lungs labored arduously. His eyes widened painfully. He looked down, straining his neck, his chin pressed into the upper section of his chest, where his necktie was loosened. There was an exit hole in the left side of his chest, a fraction of an inch from the center. Dizzy, he shut his eyes tightly, as another shockwave ripped through his body. It was his turn to die. No! He wouldn't die yet. Not literally. He would wrestle mortality to its death, before he ever surrendered to mortality.
Not yet, death. Not today.
He muttered defiantly as he tried to muster strength to move and get help, somewhere, somehow.
I'm too young to die.
As if in a dream, he heard a motorbike roar softly past the T-junction, several yards up the long, red road. Then there was only the rustling of silver leaves, shimmering like many silver coins falling into a sun-glazed lake, engulfing him, also, the scurrying of small, vapor-like creatures in the nearby glistening bushes, which were perhaps the only witnesses to the worst day of his and Grace's lives. The rumbling of the heavy vehicle, which he had heard first, returned, this time much louder, and closer. Then Joey's world began furling and twirling and coiling up and spreading and darkening and getting colder. He turned his face painfully towards the suffocating sky and howled and yelled, like a madman in unbearable agony. But any observer, including Grace, if she was semi-conscious, which he hoped she was, would only hear him mumbling weakly under his fleeting breath. The advancing rumbling vehicle seemed to stop some feet away behind him, then the rumble was replaced by an echoing chuckle, like a drunken man grumbling loudly in an empty, spacious hall. And Joey didn't know when he collapsed beside Grace, in the sight of two bright headlights, nor when a pair of slim, dark hands felt their pulses, and then lifted him, placed him into the back of a red Chevrolet pickup van, and then stabbed the keypad of a mobile phone with an anxious index finger, barked into the device, something about a dead young lady, and rushing a dying man to the hospital, and to look out for a light-skinned man driving a church bus, nor when a hand slammed a driver's door shut and the other rocked the gear stick from park to drive, then both hands gripped the steering wheel, controlling it angrily as the van swiftly, but carefully, navigated the bumpy, winding dirt road. Nor when the van was racing away from the sparsely populated area of the community of Simple City, located in the large parish of Manchester, in the beautiful island of Jamaica, which is among other larger and smaller islands dotting the Caribbean Sea, a small region of a half of the planet Earth now covered under the thick blanket of nightfall, closing off Joey's and Grace's last sunset together. Forever.